Back to the Roots podcast is brought to you by Soil Biotics. Soil Biotics Organic Growth Boost is a liquid humic acid product that promotes the conversion of nutrient elements such as N, P, and K into forms more available to plants, thereby improving uptake of nutrients, micronutrients, and water. It also improves the biological structure of the soil by helping to neutralize both acid and alkaline soils. Soil Biotics SB 4400 is a liquid product containing a combination of living beneficial microorganisms that allows plants to take in nitrogen from the atmosphere, enhances natural growth promoting functions in the plant, and can increase organic matter and CEC in the soil. Soil Biotics organic products are formulated to work together to provide a continuous beneficial growth environment to meet all of your organic agricultural needs. For product details, visit soilbiotics.com. This episode of Back to the Roots podcast is brought to you by Byron Seeds. The folks at Byron Seeds believe organic requires a different perspective, plan, and approach. Organic isn't simply a different type of product or even a different way of farming. It's a different way of thinking, planning, commitment. It's a different philosophy on how to feed the world. Many won't understand, but the people at Byron Seeds do. We're owned by organic dairy farmers. We not only have the product, but we plan, manage, and execute organic. We speak your language, we share your struggles, and we laud your successes. Organic isn't a way of doing business, it's a community. We learn from each other. We're in this together. We'd be glad to talk cropping plans, management systems, the road to profitability. We understand what you're trying to do. We're farmers just like you. Visit us at byronseeds.net or give us a call at 800-801-3596. And thanks to Byron Seeds. We're excited that Neutral Foods is also sponsoring today's episode. Neutral Foods is the first carbon-neutral food company in the United States and offers dairy and beef products nationwide. They're on a mission to radically reduce the nearly 37% of global emissions produced by agriculture and the food system. Started in 2019 in Portland, Oregon, Neutral works directly with farmers to reduce the carbon footprint of dairy and beef products for good. Neutral Foods is built on the belief that the world is worth protecting and that together people can make a real impact with our daily food choices. You can find their carbon-neutral organic milk nationwide at Whole Foods, Sprouts, The Fresh Market, Imperfect Foods, and more. Learn about how Neutral supports farmers adopting climate-smart ag practices at eatneutral.com.
You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast. I'm Mike Klein, and along with Brian Wood, we are in Portland, Oregon, and sitting down with Ann Radil, head of carbon reduction for Neutral Foods, and Jake Schmitz, who is the carbon reduction manager. So thank you both so much for taking the time to sit down with us. And Ann, can we start with you and give us a little bit of background on what Neutral Foods is and also your role there?
Sure. Thanks so much for having us. So great to be here. So Neutral Foods is the first wholly carbon neutral food company in the United States. Wholly in a sense, and all of our products are carbon neutral. We're starting with animal-based agriculture and dairy specifically for a number of different reasons. Dairy is a significant contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, but we know that mitigation options exist and dairy farms can be massive carbon sinks. So we're starting there because it's technically possible. We're starting there because we feel like being in milk, we're going to always be in carbon neutral staples. We're not going to make carbon neutral turmeric. We want to focus on the products that folks are buying today. 96% of U.S. households still have some form of U.S. dairy in their fridge. So we're starting there because there's a significant opportunity for climate impact, significant penetration, and therefore opportunity to scale. And when you're trying to do something as strange as introduce new consumers to a food category that has never existed before, such as carbon neutral, it's really useful to have that storytelling canvas of a carton of milk to introduce who you are and why you're doing what you do. So that's Neutral Foods. We're an animal-based agriculture, carbon neutral food company, starting with dairy. We've got milk and butter SKUs and really growing retail business. I think you can find us in 2,200 stores nationwide, and we've got a growing food service presence in the Pacific Northwest. And pretty soon we're going to launch our first grass-fed, grass-finished carbon neutral beef product. So that's who we are. We're carbon neutral staples. Yeah.
And what is your role within Neutral?
Yeah. So I lead the carbon reduction function. So, when you want to sell a product with the core value proposition being on carbon neutrality, you need to make sure that all of your science and math adds up in the sense of the total climate impact of your products is completely eliminated. So in leading the carbon neutral function, the things that the team are primarily responsible for are, first and foremost, rigorously accounting the entire life cycle carbon emissions for each of our products. So when we measure the carbon footprint of a half gallon of milk, we're talking about everything that happens on farm, the transportation of that milk to co-packing, everything that happens in retail, everything that happens in disposal. It's very broad. It's a true cradle to grave analysis. And as broad as that analysis or that life cycle assessment is, it's also really deep. It considers things like, how much of the, dairy, it represents how much of the carbon footprint of the dairies from we source from is that really coming from enteric methane or what the cows are belching versus how manure is managed versus how is feed produced. It also considers when consumers are going to buy our milk at a store, how much of that grocery cart is milk versus other things, therefore how much of that transportation impact should we shield. So when it comes to that rigorous life cycle accounting, we're really fortunate. We work closely with a gentleman named Dr. Greg Toma. He recently joined the AgNext team at Colorado State University, and he's arguably the seminal expert. He spent 10 years of his career determining what is the carbon footprint of milk. He's visited 532 dairies in that pursuit. So he tweaks his scientific models and his calculations to our benefit to represent our regional sourcing. So the team works with Toma and other scientists to account for that climate impact. But really the heart of the work that the team does is all about how do we creatively eliminate that impact for good. So when we started Neutral in Portland in 2019, there are 3 of us who are working on this product. And so the reason that we're able to have a product on shelf and confidently say, hey, we've eliminated the climate impact is we used offsets, meaning we purchased carbon offsets from anaerobic digester projects, largely supporting kind of beneficial manure management and energy reuse at large dairies. But the dairies that we source from aren't those really large dairies. They're these very small family-owned, pasture-based, largely organic dairy farms. And so it takes time, as you all well know, working with producers to really understand, what are your goals of an operation? And how can we collectively draw that Venn diagram of like the long-term legacy and the improvements that you want to make on that farm and where there are meaningful mitigation opportunities, and then co-develop those projects. So I'd say the beating heart of the work that we do at Neutral, especially on the carbon reduction team, is developing a diverse portfolio of projects in partnership with our producers to decarbonize our supply chain. And that work really comes down to understanding, scientifically, where do those mitigation opportunities exist, and then being really surgical about mapping and what are the barriers that are keeping producers from adopting these today. Because 9 times out of 10, in the projects that we're developing, and I can go into more detail about what those are, but 9 times out of 10, financial access is a hurdle, but it's not the only one. Producers also need advice and subject matter experts that they can connect to. Even better, they want someone in their producer network who's adopted this, who can tell them, hey, I did this and it increased the value of my operations or decreased my operating costs or it increased profitability. And here's, some numbers to demonstrate that. So the work that we do with producers is really about how do we find that sweet spot of delivering on our mandate to decarbonize agriculture and solve producers' concerns. Because for the most producers that we work with, they might not be kept up at night thinking, oh no, I'm emitting so many greenhouse gas emissions, but they are kept up at night on some of the other problems that their projects solve. So maybe I'll just talk about one example of that, if that would be useful. Mm-hmm. Okay. So when we think about these small dairy farms and the types of projects that we can implement to reduce their carbon footprint, our LCA data tells us, our life cycle assessment data tells us that roughly a third of greenhouse gas emissions today come from enteric methane, or cows burping. Roughly a third of the emissions come from how manure is managed, and roughly a third come from how feed is produced. Of course, there's on-farm energy and there's some others, but those are the three principal buckets. So when we talk to producers, we're thinking about, hey, how could we maybe change what cows are eating to reduce enteric methane? How can we better manage manure solids and enable composting to reduce that manure footprint? How can we look at alternative feedstuffs or improve the carbon efficiency of how your feed is produced? And we just developed a big project with a dairy producer about 45 minutes southwest of Portland around manure management. So I can kind of talk about that as an example to bring this to life a little. But when we talk to him, the way his dairy farm works, typical of these smaller dairies is, a lot of times animals are out on pasture. Sometimes it's nasty weather. They're being milked. There's some sort of confinement. Manure accumulates. It's, scraped or flushed into a pond. What we're doing is, investing in infrastructure in partnership with a producer in NRCS to basically build a technical solution for separating out those volatile solids before they ever enter the pond. The reason that we want to do that at Neutral is by allowing those, if those solids, absent this equipment to separate them, if those solids just went into the pond, they would decompose anaerobically and give off a bunch of methane, which, as we know, is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Anytime you can eliminate methane in favor of carbon dioxide, you're going to significantly reduce carbon footprint just because of the significant difference in global warming potential. So we want to keep those separate. We want to keep those solids out because we don't want the methane. We want those volatile solids to be turned into compost. And there's a significant greenhouse gas benefit. Just simply by doing that alone on an average dairy farm, you can reduce manure-related emissions by 19%, which is a big chunk. But our producer who we're working with, he's like, I don't love methane, but what really keeps me up is I've been dewatering that lagoon to grow my adjacent hay fields, and my nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium limits are getting pretty high, and my regulators are flagging that this is a concern. Also, it's taking a lot of time and labor to manage the manure the way I'm doing it. So for our purposes, we value the carbon. We'll pay for that carbon reduction. We'll put money in there, and we'll bring together the right subject matter experts to deliver on that solid liquid manure separator. We love that methane benefit, that the greenhouse gas emission reduction that occurs. The producer loves that they've reduced their regulatory risk and that they have lower operating costs because there's less labor needed in managing and processing their manure. And so that's the kind of solution that we love to develop, are ones that have a climate benefit for us, but of course, increase the value of the operation as well. Yeah.
So one of the things that working with small dairy farms ourselves, one of the challenges I see for you're saying like carbon sequestration is that they're doing a lot of the things already that are sequestering carbon and haven't gotten paid for many years through carbon credits or whatever it may be. To me, it looks like the large dairies are the ones that can make the biggest changes and benefit the most. So that there's this imbalance here. How do you go about leveling that scale?
That's a really good question because there's so much that goes into that. So maybe a little bit of context. So my family's been ranching for going on 5 generations in Northwest Nebraska, and we're like very much in the center of this too. We've been great stewards and managing for soil health for a long time because, as you know, producers are like one of the few jobs who start that job day one thinking about their legacy and succession planning. It's such a unique career field, and whereas the rest of us who aren't working in agriculture are so much more mobile typically. But yeah, and so it's hard because you're right. There is an absolute tension there of people who have a strong track record of managing for conservation outcomes and are saying, hey, there's this interest and need and desire to monetize carbon. Can I be a part of that? And on the one hand, you don't want any producers left out in the cold. You want them to be valued for those ecosystem services that sustain the value of their operations, let alone like rural and economic livelihoods. But from a climate perspective, what most matters when you're trying to balance the scales of like, hey, we've been emitting too much, and now we either need to reduce those emissions or even remove them through tree planting. And what matters there is only what's additional, meaning only are the practices or the improvements made that would further, reduce or remove carbon emissions that would otherwise occur. So there's absolutely the tension there in terms of, are we just now further incentivizing people who didn't invest in sustainability earlier? Yes, there's a tension there. Also the tension that I think you're rightly putting a finger to, which is, well, if we're only providing incentives for people to reduce carbon once they're already emitting so many carbon emissions, where does that leave these really small producers? And I think one of the unique things about Neutral and what I'm really hopeful about is we're hoping that the sale of our products demonstrate to producers, to innovators, that there is consumer demand for this, that can create a secondary stream of value that can go to smaller scale producers. Like, we are specifically seeking to influence the unique supply chains that we source from, which are these small producers. And in order to do that, we need some additional resources to bring to bear to decarbonize that farm. So our model, our theory of change, our way of working says, consumer who's at your local grocery store shopping and you have climate angst and you want to make right choices, and that food is, a significant source of impact, but you might not everyone is going to become vegan, and not everyone is going to, necessarily offset their way out of this problem. And so what we're trying to do is kind of align these incentives for people who do purchase animal-based dairy and meat, for that source of revenue to become the means of enabling this smaller farm kind of decarbonization, if you will, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And this might be a good spot for Jake to introduce himself and then talk a little bit about measurement, because that's where, and I'm talking just personally here, that going on small farms, I see the practices they do of grazing. To me, that's a huge carbon sink. How do you measure that? And how, because right now the way that projects are currently being paid for carbon credits are, something where they're installing some sort of infrastructure in a lot of cases, whether it's trees or a manure separator or solar panels or whatever it may be. So first of all, how are those projects measured? And then what can be measured for, that's a broader question of like what can be measured of plants that are sequestering carbon and the practices that farmers are doing.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, for having me on, and thanks for the question. And I'm Jake Schmitz, the carbon reduction manager at Neutral Foods. And so, when I think about these small farms and the kinds of farms they have, it is challenging to find ways to improve them a lot of times because they're doing so many things so well. And but there are small tweaks that you can make, and it might be a small tweak based on maybe the amount of chicory that they might include in their pastures, or the variety of chicory might be a little better if they switch the varieties, because the tannins in chicory, for instance, the reason I bring this up, the tannins in chicory will help reduce the enteric methane if you have enough of those tannins in the diet. So you have to make sure you get 20-30% or so stand during that heat time of summer to be able to get that amount of tannins to reduce that reduction. But it's not any old chicory. All chicory has some tannins in it, but certain varieties have more. And so, even though people are doing amazing jobs, they still can be tweaked just a little bit to help them make a bigger impact. But as far as measuring how much reduction is going on for a pasture environment, like through grazing techniques, you're going to have to look at the soil organic carbon. and see how much it is increasing from the time before they do the project, the baseline, what it was before the intervention happened, and then measure it likely years down the road, a year, maybe 5 years, and on like that, just to be able to record differences in the amount of soil organic carbon that would be there, because that soil organic carbon would be coming ultimately from the atmosphere as CO2, growing the plants that put the energy and the biomass into the root systems that later turn into the soil organic matter.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, Jake. And like as a rule of thumb, something that we think about a lot is, we're trying to quickly turn down that greenhouse gas emissions dial. And if you look at infrastructure or plans to, reduce emissions that would otherwise occur, you can typically measure those faster if you're looking at solutions that are designed to put more carbon back into the natural ecosystem, whether that's increasing long-term carbon storage in plants or underground in soils. You're going to have a lot more variability, and it's going to take you a lot longer to see kind of like the sound through the noise, and also demonstrate, hey, these forests have been growing for 40 years, 100 years. I mean, we're talking to some producers about some projects that are designed to get more carbon back in the system. And when we're seeking to align our measurement, reporting, and verification with established best practices, we're like, hey, we're talking about a 40-year project. Are you willing to sign up for that? Versus, should we trial some feed supplements for 6 months? Like, there's a very different kind of like level of commitment. And so I think where we found some like quick wins are in things that are those like infrastructure investments that I think a producer can readily see, hey, I see the co-benefits of this. I see how this increases the value of my operations pretty quickly. And then I'm hopeful that in some of the long-term partnerships that Jake is already building with our producer community, that with time, we're going to get a couple of those quick wins on those near-term reductions, such that those longer-term removals or sequestration projects, they might be more willing to partner with us on, because it's a bigger commitment.
Mm-hmm. So, Jake, when you look at a 40-cow producer that has, a bedded pack, so he has solid manure, he doesn't have liquid manure, besides like the pasture mix, what he's grazing and the feed he's putting up, what other little things can he do? Is it then agroforestry, or is there something that he can do that is actually a big enough gain to make it worth for you to do a project on the farm?
That's a very good question, Mike. It is very difficult to help these small farmers that are doing excellent jobs already. It's very difficult to find the places they can improve. But one of the places where I find, especially in the Amish community that uses a lot of diesel fuel, could possibly be electrifying it with solar panels. Instead, you reduce, basically the rule of thumb is 100 gallons of diesel fuel will, when once burned, creates 1 metric ton, very close to it, of CO2 equivalents, or it actually is CO2 in that case. So 100 gallons of fuel makes 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions. And so that's one place. Plate coolers are another place. You think about how much energy goes into a compressor to cool milk. And if that milk's hitting the tank already cool, that's less you have to use energy to bring the temperatures down. So it can be things like that. The liquid manure comes from the scrape lanes in a compost pack barn, because I'm not sure exactly what the percentage is, but I'm guessing it's probably 20% or so of the manure is going to end up in that scrape lane as cows go to feed or drink. And so composting that manure could be a place where you can make a small change. And I already mentioned the chicory, planting the proper varieties of chicory to increase tannins and things like that. But you're right. It is the small dairy farmers are doing an excellent job. A lot of them daily spread. The ones that you see in tie stall barns, a lot of them have gravity fed systems, and tie stall barns catch a lot of flack in the world. But the one thing they do have going for them is they don't have a lot of tractors being used. It's all hand labor or gravity taking the manure out for a daily spread. And so the small farmers are doing excellent work, and I'm so proud to represent a lot of these small farmers, because it's their LCA that Ann talked about earlier helps. It's so small already that you don't have to offset very much from them. So that's the benefit of working with these small farmers. They already are doing really good for the earth. And emissions are basically, that I've found, are basically inefficiencies in the system. If they're belching out all this methane, well, they're not digesting their food maybe as good as they could. I mean, they're always going to belch out some. We are in the animal kingdom, and everything in the animal kingdom is going to have emissions, including you and I, termites, worms. We're all going to emit. And so to reduce it as much as you can, so feed supplements is the one big thing that I found small farmers can use. An essential oil that basically, the thing that creates methane in a manure pond or in the rumen is a methanogen. It's a bacteria that emits methane. It creates methane through its process of eating, basically. And so this essential oil product that we can supplement with on organic herds, what it does, it basically kicks back the methanogens, and so there's less being produced, methane being produced and belched out. And so that's one spot that I find that I can work with small herds that almost nobody's already supplementing essential oils. So and so that's the place I like to start. And then once you're in there doing a project, then you start looking at their forest land and things like that. And maybe you can do a lot. I see a lot of creeks that don't have a strong riparian zone. And if you can put a riparian zone in for a farmer, it stabilizes their banks, creates a wildlife corridor, creates shade for the animals during the heat, shelter. So it's kind of finding those small wins in the beginning and looking to see what we can do holistically on the whole farm, just to create as many beneficial projects as possible with an individual.
So what kind of feedback are you getting from farmers as you're going out? Because I'm just putting myself, working with farmers. There can be some grumpy fellas that say, well, what do I need to protect my stream for? Like, that's where I get my water. You're going to cost me money. Or I'm not getting extra milk by feeding this supplement. Why should I do it?
Right. Well, but for the supplement that we're recommending, the research is showing that it does produce about 4.5% extra production, and it reduces your feed requirement by about 4.5%. So you're feeding a little bit less dry matter, and you're getting a little bit more milk because it's a little bit more efficient, because the methanogens aren't stealing all those nutrients from the rumen. And so it does improve the production. And this product isn't designed for greenhouse gas emissions. It just so happens to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They created this product to help farmers get more out of their feed. And so it just so happened to be a great benefit that helps my mission a lot, to reduce the greenhouse gases. But when I'm on a farm, there's a lot of things we can do. And so I look for things that the farmer needs first. I kind of just, when I go to a farm first, I meet the farmer, learn a little bit about their history, and just kind of get a good feeling about how they're farming. Go look at their manure systems, look at how they treat their cows, figure out if they're grazing enough, all these things. And I try to find something that will be beneficial for this farmer. And listening to the farmer, just to see what they need, see what they're complaining about in their operations that's not efficient enough, or whatever, and I just try to find that common place to where whenever I do a project with them, they will be excited about it. If they're grumpy about the riparian zone or something, I won't even go there. I will steer clear and look for the place where the sweet spot where they want to work with me. And I find that farmers so far have been very receptive and inviting me onto the farm. I get calls back all the time, brainstorming. People get pretty excited. Because the one thing I noticed when I would go onto farms, and it's not just the farmers don't quite understand this, the industry still doesn't understand this. nobody really understands where the emissions are coming from on their farms necessarily. I mean, we know about it overall. I mean, it's known, it's published out there and stuff. That information can be published out there and stuff. But a farmer, for instance, I go in the Pacific Northwest where we have mostly all hydropower, so there's no coal or natural gas being burned for our electricity. It's just all gravity-fed water. So there's no greenhouse gas emissions in our energy out here. A lot of it, a lot of our energy in the Pacific Northwest. But when I show up on farms, farmers think that, for climate change, well, where do you want to put the solar panels, Jake? Well, in the Pacific Northwest, I don't want to do solar panels because it's not going to reduce any carbon whatsoever. However, if I'm in Kentucky or in the Ohio River Valley where they burn a lot of coal, well, shoot, yeah, let's put some solar panels in because their energy grid has a lot of carbon in it. And so it's going onto a farm. Every farm is different. Farmers are different. The power grids are different. The resources they have available are different. It's just really climbing in and, like Dr. Paul Detloff used to say, climb into the ecosystem and figure it out with the farmer, And so, that's just kind of my approach, just trying to find common things that the farmer wants to work on. And there's usually several things, but the relationships have been wonderful so far. And I feel like I'm making lifelong friends with this job already.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a balance of you're there offering, and you guys can talk a little bit about this, through Neutral, some help with funding of whatever project they might do, but you also have to give an economic reason, because part of why they might give you pushback is because they're also going through economic struggles of some kind or another. So, hearing that there's a payback on feeding whatever it is or whatever project they may undertake, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And as Ann said earlier, really nobody I'm going onto their farms or sitting there laying awake at night thinking, oh my gosh, I got all this methane going into the atmosphere. I mean, nobody's doing that, but they do have a lot of things that they'd like to improve on their farms. And we like to say something, at Neutral about the projects that we do, like they all have co-benefits. Like we're not offering anything to farmers that doesn't have co-benefits to help them with economics or herd health or efficiencies in some way, maybe less labor. For instance, I'm looking into right now putting a composting drum in for a farmer. And the alternative is to have long rows of compost that they're turning with, labor and tractors and time. And this compost turner will just do all that for them. And 3 days later, they have finished compost. And then they don't have to have, here in the Pacific Northwest, it rains all the time. So you'd also have to have a roof over all those windrows to keep them dry enough to where the composting process would even work. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of things we look for. We look for the co-benefits, and and we point out those co-benefits with the farmer, and because that's what they're making their decisions on. They're not making it on how much greenhouse gases they're reducing. They're making decisions on how much money it's going to save them, or how much more milk they're going to get, or how much labor they're going to have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think as we build this competency at Neutral, we've never had a bad conversation with a producer, because every producer that we talk to, no matter how fantastic and progressive and innovative they are or aren't, there's always a laundry list of improvements that they want to make on their operation. They might not necessarily know how those tether to a climate benefit, but when we say we want to provide you the financial resources, we want to provide you with advice, we want to build on all of the past learnings from our projects, and guess what? We lead in our conversation with them. The core value proposition is this improvement will deliver these benefits that we know you care about. So as we're endeavoring to become, and I know it sounds kind of hyperbolic, but as we're endeavoring as a team to become the best in the world at partnering with producers, so much of that is our leveling up our ability to effectively communicate the benefits of these projects and then deliver, so we can say, do you want to talk to someone else who we've worked with? Because no, we will never be as effective sales people to our farmer and ranchers as another farmer and rancher who we've worked with, who's like, here's how far I would have gone without neutral, and here's what I was able to do with them, and this is the type of support that they provided and the benefit that I realized. And we just had a really interesting conversation with a couple producers last night, and when we got to sit back and let the producers do the talking for us, we were like, let's take a beat here, because we should always do it this way, because farmers are going to trust other farmers, ranchers trust other ranchers.
Yep.
Like in our role, Brian, I mean, farmers ask us questions, and if I can give them a name of a farmer that's doing X, Y, or Z, like, go to him.
Yeah.
I'm not doing it. I know this guy does, so just connecting that, because that's what carries weight, is that farmer to farmer. But now, when you fund projects, you then in return get those carbon credits for X amount of time or whatever that you then that would go against your carbon footprint.
Exactly.
Neutral. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So our project development cycle goes from meeting the right farmer, understanding his and her interests, mapping like what are the possible improvements that we could make to reduce or remove emissions, and then when we're developing those work plans, we have a stage where we upfront model the climate benefit of that project, and we assign a value to that, to the metric tons that will be reduced or removed, and we pay the producer that up front. That's different than how most voluntary carbon markets work, which say, hey, producer, incur the costs up front of making this change and transforming your operation. And when you've shown us that it's done when you've shown us that it's delivered the climate benefit, then we'll cut the check. But as anyone knows who's trying to make a change in your life, like sometimes you need that financial money up front in order to enable that. And so we kind of put one of the ways we like to think that we're putting our money where our mouth is we're saying we'll do all the scientific analysis of what that climate benefit is. And if we get it wrong, that's on us. That's not on you, because you're implementing the change. And then with our producers, getting that project in the ground, that's just the beginning. Like the long tail of all of our projects are the years of the effectiveness monitoring that then happen to measure and verify that the climate benefit that we thought would occur did in fact occur. And we need to demonstrate that as a part of our kind of independent third-party verification that we go through to support our carbon neutral claims. So it's just part of how we have kind of like this ecosystem of accountability to try to make this new way of working. Mm-hmm.
So we talked a little bit, I'm just thinking of the third group of manure management. Remind me of the...
enteric fermentation.
There you go. We talked. And then the last one is the one I want to find out from you guys where you're at on feed production. What practices, because we talked a little bit about feed stuffs that could help with enteric methane or burping and manure management, but where are things at? And the reason I ask, and you can tie organic in here a little bit, is, I assume organic kind of goes hand in hand with the practices that you're looking to do. But for feed production, there isn't a, what's the word I'm looking for? The tillage, no tillage.
Oh, no-till?
No-till, there we go. Yeah, there isn't a proven program that works for organic no-till. Where are things at with that third? What kind of things are being done in your world?
So, there's one thing that a lot of people know about, and that's cover cropping. But cover cropping just doesn't always reduce or sequester carbon or whatnot. It's you're using it for a fertilizer, but you got to be careful on how you do it, because whenever you till in a cover crop and it's say it's a pretty young cover crop, so it's going to have a lot of nitrogen in it, right? And the carbon nitrogen ratio is going to be off. You want, just like a compost pile, when you till that into the ground, you want it to be a 25-to-1 to 30-to-1 ratio. And so a lot of people will till it in early or too late. If you till it in early, it's too much nitrogen and it creates a lot of nitrous oxide gases whenever it goes in, which is very potent greenhouse gas. And so you think you're doing something positive and you're going backwards. Or if you wait too late, then it's got too much carbon in it, and now you're stealing the nitrogen from your soil and from the crop that could be growing. Now you're going to get lower yields. So helping farmers understand those kinds of things is one piece of that. Just helping them farm in a way that's not only going to reduce emissions, but like I said, emissions are inefficiencies. And so if they do it just right, then they're going to get great benefit from that cover crop. And that's why like a biodiverse cover crop is so important, because you're going to have some things that are immature, and you're going to have some things that are over mature. But when you have a way better chance to hit that 25 to 30 to 1 ratio if you have a lot of biodiversity. So those are kind of things. So you're kind of also, it's not all about sequestration. It's about reducing the amount of emissions that the current practices are creating. And so that's one of them. But another big one is renewable fertilizers, manures, is in composts. Whenever you're using synthetic nitrogen, not only does that nitrogen turn a lot to nitrous oxide again, but to make that nitrogen fertilizer requires natural gas and a lot of energy. If you think about in nature where nitrogen comes from, one place is from lightning. And think about the amount of energy that lightning has in it to make that nitrogen. It's kind of the same thing, same process, but synthetically done using equipment. And it requires a ton of energy, natural gas, and then once you apply it, and we all know how a lot of farmers apply to their crops, they will front load a lot of fertilizer, and they might put 3 times more nitrogen than the crop needs, but a lot of it's going to leach into the groundwater below or volatilize as nitrous oxide into the atmosphere above, and there's going to be a third of that fertilizer that you put out there left for the nitrogen need for the crop in the end, which is incredibly expensive. Again, an emission that is an inefficiency. And so if you use a composted, more nitrogen stable fertilizer, or a plow down from the crop before, because in organic, as you mentioned, you asked about organic specifically, you're not going to be able to spray herbicide on it so you want to do a shallow kill down with a disc or something, not getting very deep, staying in the aerobic part of the soil, so you don't bring up a lot of the carbon from deep into the soils. So it's basically same kind of thing. You're looking to reduce emissions more than you are to sequester carbon in crop production. But whenever you get into sequestration, I should say, that's when you're getting into trees and things. And so, but a lot of farmers don't have the land for trees. So you're really looking at reductions on most farms to have them farm the most efficiently as they can. And if you're farming as efficiently as you can to reduce the greenhouse gases, since there's inefficiencies in those greenhouse gases, you're going to be efficient in your operation too.
So when you talk about renewable fertilizers, a good old-fashioned crop rotation goes a long way. Grow your legume for your corn crop. But anytime, and again, organics, anytime you get into monoculture, I think that's the problem.
Biodiversity is a major key to the world's ecosystem. You look at every ecosystem around the planet, and there's a lot of diversity there. You look at I can't think of a ecosystem around the world that doesn't have plants and animals. So I think animals is a part of the biodiversity that really helps, because, like I said, manure is definitely a renewable fertilizer source. Well, you have to have animals to get that manure. And so having that full cycle of the whole ecosystem and mimicking your farm like an ecosystem is very important. I agree with your biodiversity comment.
Because I'm seeing with 100% grass-fed herds, there are some that will grow a monoculture, a summer annual, but there's a lot that don't. And they have hay fields that haven't been touched in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and they're all very diverse. So their whole farm is completely diverse. There's no monoculture. So that has to be a benefit.
Absolutely. And so we're talking too about there can be sequestration with crop production. And I have one example in Kentucky, in Horse Cave, Kentucky, right outside of Mammoth Cave National Park. There's a farm that I worked with for many years through several jobs. First, I worked with them when I was with Kentucky Department of Agriculture, and I was their certifier. And whenever he sent in his soil samples on his farm, he had less than 1% organic matter in his soils. And he had an off-farm job to pay for his farming habit that he had, basically. But he was persistent. He was a grazer, a dairy farmer grazer, and he would find the worst spot on his farm every year and grow his corn silage in that spot. It required tillage, so he was tilling, but most of his farm was in perennial pasture. And so that real weak spot where he wasn't growing very good pasture, he tilled it up, put his manure on there, planted a corn crop, cultivated it, destroyed the weed cycle, and grew feed for his cattle right there where it didn't have to be trucked to his farm because it was produced right there on his farm. And then whenever that year was over and that corn crop was harvested, he would plant it back into permanent pasture. And its weed cycle was disrupted, so the seeds that he put in there thrived, and the manure from the corn crop that was left helped the grasses thrive. And of course, he planted a biodiverse pasture like a lot of good small dairies do, with legumes and forbs and grasses. And so then I was working with him through a different job throughout the next decade. But about 7 or 8 years in, he called me and was bragging about his soil samples. They came back over 5% organic matter through tillage. But he's only tilling each little postage stamp on his farm basically once every 6 or 7 years, and the rest of the time it's in a perennial. And so he went from less than 1% organic matter to over 5% organic matter in about 7 years. And the most interesting thing about that is he quit his job and he was a full-time farmer. He didn't have to work in a factory anymore once he built his soil to a level that would sustain his farm. And he's a dear friend and a fantastic farmer. And, when you do the math on that, I can't remember what it is now, but it's tons and tons that he sequestered on just a little 40-cow dairy. Mm-hmm. So, but it was through crop production that helped him do that, through tillage. So it's not only no-till that can do it, but you got to have a diverse system. And that perennial pasture, biodiverse perennial pasture, where the most of his diversity was on his farm and doing all the heavy work.
The John Kemp, when we had him on the podcast, mentioned that the crop that's better at photosynthesizing than any other crop is corn. So he said you can harvest more sunlight with corn than any other crop. You look at corn as a feeder and it's going to just drain your soils. But he says if it's managed right, it can be very beneficial in actually building your soils.
I agree with that. I do feel like the amount of photosynthesis on per acre, that's what we need to do. We need to increase the amount of photosynthesis per acre. You think of a forest and think about all those leaves that those trees have and how layers of leaves. I mean, you're going up, 100 feet. Sometimes in the Pacific Northwest here, you're going up 300 feet, and there's leaves all the way down to the ground. And so you're capturing all those layers of sunlight, photosynthesizing that much. And in that forest, you're building all that wood that sequesters all that carbon. So even on a farm level, that's what I think about a lot. Like if I see bare spots in a pasture or something like that, that needs seeds on it. It needs to be completely covered where you don't see one piece of sunlight hitting any soil. So you have leaves catching all that sunlight and photosynthesizing, putting exudates into the soils, growing soils, increasing soil organic matters, all those things, creating, and it's not just the soil organic matter, the biota, the amount of biology that is on a piece of ground is a big sequester of carbon. I'm not going to tell you how much I weigh, but I got a lot of carbon in me. And, that's all through eating and stuff. So I'm carrying a big carbon source with me. And you think about whales and all these organisms, that's an ocean organism, but think about all the microbes they say that's in a tablespoon. You hear that like a biological active tablespoon of soil has more microbes in it than the population on Earth of humans. So you take all the microbes weight, all the birds, all the worms, all the dung beetles, you add all that together, it's tons and tons and tons of carbon that's living, coexisting in that ecosystem.
And I love the way you put it, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but greenhouse gas output is just inefficiencies.
Right.
And that there is something that, I think we all can take directly to farmers of, you're not just doing something good for the planet. You're doing something good for yourself and your pocketbook and your cows. And it's this cycle. And sometimes it's hard to convince a farmer of that. That's why I asked the question of what's the reception that you get from farmers when you go out with this message.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think the more we work with farmers, the more they get excited. They come up with ideas. Like I don't know how long my list of that I need to try to research out for farmers that called me and said, "Hey Jake, what about this? What about that?" And they're thinking about everything because we're not farmers, so we don't know things. So like one farmer is like, "Jake, you know how many plastic bags I burn every year? Or not? I'm sorry, paper feed bags I'm burning every year because I don't know what else to do with them, and I have all this paper here, and I know it's heavy because I'm the one moving them around." And he's like, "So is there anything we can do with that?" So it's like there's no idea that's too small. And no dumb idea. We all need to put our thinking hats on sideways for a second and think about how our farm is affecting the greenhouse gas emissions or the environment. And, people have all these ideas, and some of them turn into be some of the best ideas I've ever heard, just, coming from people who didn't even know where their emissions were coming from 5 minutes ago. And here they are teaching me stuff the next second because they turned their thinking cap on sideways and seen something that was in front of them all along, but didn't know that it was even an emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it's just it does take a lot of conversations and relationship building, but then they get excited about it, just as excited and enthusiastic as I get, and it turns into a lot of long conversations, and now I don't know how I'll ever have the amount of hours in the day to be able to vet all these ideas that I get, but we do have about a dozen interventions that we have that we can go onto a farm and be confident that the research is there, that it works, monitoring behind us that we've seen that it's worked, and so we have enough to work on already. But I hope those ideas keep coming because it's going to take every one of us working together on this to be able to tackle the issue that's in front of us.
Mm-hmm. I've got the solution for the guy with the paper bags. It's a simple little leaf shredder. Use it as bedding.
Yeah.
All my paper that I have in my office goes through the leaf shredder and is bedding for my steers. And the chickens. Works great. Like, it's way better than burning it.
Absolutely.
But do you realize how much plastic is in junk mail? Like window envelopes? Well, I don't want that in my manure. But it's still, it's cheaper than buying bedding, I guess. So all the nonprofits that want money, I'll just use them for bedding. So, Brian, you go ahead.
I was going to change the topic.
Go ahead.
Because we've talked a lot about farmers, and I wanted to go back to just broader neutral business side of things of, we're talking from the farmer side, how do you convince them? There's some pushback, I'm sure, and there's just convincing. And, I'm looking, and I want to change it to the consumer side. Yeah. And everybody's aware of the planet and issues that are happening, but then you get into the terms like carbon sequestration, and some of the stuff that we're talking about gets very, very technical. How do you tell a consumer these stories that makes them want to purchase something that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, we have really fantastic marketing colleagues that have a lot of deep chops and expertise. So if you talk to me, I'm enmeshed in the carbon accounting side, and how do we take the passion and the solutions and the wild ideas and vet those to and which of those will translate into something that helps our carbon balance sheet. You've got Jake representing us with the farmers, who's just trying to be the best ally and advocate he can. And as you can hear him talking, the whole, thinking, yes, of course we're leading with carbon, but he's obviously considering the whole ecosystem. When it comes to our marketing team, they're super creative, thinking about how do we engage the right, people with the right level of information and the right format, especially when, if our view is that at some point you might have a carbon neutral food aisle when you go grocery store shopping, we have a long way to go to get there. And there's some really basic education around, the value proposition and the terms, let alone the problem that we're trying to solve as we go. And so I think, with neutral, that education and that outreach and that attempt to get people's attention, frankly, happens in a lot of different places. If you see our packaging, it's really distinct. It's these bright yellow colors that are, kind of eye-popping in the milk section. If we're so fortunate that we have a consumer who takes time to turn over that food carton, we've got a team of people who are really thoughtful about how do we provide the right level of information. And we're even exploring should we put a QR code on the back of a half gallon of milk that someone can scan with their phone, and it provides a real-time update of how much of that carbon impact has occurred on farm, or how that relates to the overall portfolio that we're planning. And so we're always kind of trying to think, and frankly, as the first movers in this space to some degree, pressure test up against what resonates, what doesn't, where does confusion exist, how can we sidestep that. So even dedication to using the term carbon neutral versus I don't know, if we were so scared that neutral didn't sound good enough, so we want to call it something more positive. We're trying to just stay true to the scientific rigor of our approach. We're trying to meet the right consumers where they are. We're trying to serve up the right information. And frankly, we're learning as we go. There's another kind of kindred spirit in the CPG world called Moonshot Snacks. We have nothing to do with them. They're just fellow journeyers in making a climate smart snack solution. I read, there was a podcast the other day, and the CEO was talking about the mind-boggling number of times that they revisited their package in their early days, which I think was 14 different attempts to get their packaging right around this specific climate-focused messaging. So there's a lot that we're learning, and a lot of direct feedback that we get from consumers around what we're doing and what resonates and where they have questions. So I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's not one thing. It's kind of a how do we pace the play for the long road of bringing people along with us?
For all the guys who are like me, who go to the grocery store and just grab off the shelf real fast, the one good thing about our carton too, it says this milk fights climate change, real big on the front. So that's the thing that catches my eye, and what would make me put it in my cart as a man.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and the reason I asked the question, obviously we're in the organic industry, and that's a hard enough message. And we always talk about educating the consumer, and sometimes it feels like you're beating your head against the wall. When you're trying to tell this story, and it just doesn't feel like it's resonating. So that's where the question comes from, is what different avenues can be done.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, that's so kind of humbling to hear, because we look at organic as the clear front runner of we all agree that's fantastic. We all understand, at least, we're preaching to the choir, I guess, and we're we all love organic, and we know what that means, and we see why there's a lot of credibility here. But you're right, anytime.
It's still only 5% of the overall, at least dairy sales,
right.
at least. It's a very, very small chunk.
Yep.
So I want to, when you look at the dairy sector, okay, some people say the dairy sector is dying and taken over by plant-based milk or beverages. I don't even like to call it milk. But, like, dairy is, and I understand why you started in dairy, because of the 96%. I believe you said 96% of people have dairy in their fridge. But dairy is a hard business to get in because your shelf life is not great, especially not on a tanker load of milk.
Yeah.
So, of all the easy places in the food industry to start, why dairy? Is it just because of that 96% number, or you could make a bigger lasting impact by starting with animal agriculture?
Yeah, great question. And it's a number of different things, and impact is absolutely at the center of it. It's around, we're not, if we develop a perfect product that exists at the fringe, we don't have the impact that we're seeking to have from a climate perspective, which is our reason for being. And so we're always going to focus on staples, the most commonly found products in households, because, dairy in particular has that significant climate impact, has the ability to scale. The education on the consumer, those were all really interesting problems for us to try to solve. And a part of it came out of, some of Neutral's origin story stems back to, our founder was working at Nike. He was working in the innovation space. My background is I'm a climate change scientist. I was working on the sustainable business and innovation team. So we're working in this CPG company, making a lot of footwear, making a lot of apparel. And, he in his work to travel around the world and talk to consumers, what's keeping you up at night? What do you dream about? What would you love to have? I mean, the far sweeping consumer insights research that you can imagine an engine like Nike invests in. And he started to hear time and time again from all of these different people, I care about climate change, but being told to recycle my plastic water bottle or buy a Tesla next time I buy a car is falling really short. I want something that is singular, that is a day-to-day choice. And Matt, to his credit, as the founder of Neutral, he quickly zeroed in as food as the opportunity, and as staples as the opportunity for impact, especially in an area where, where with animal-based agriculture, where mitigation opportunities exist. And so I think that scale is a really key component. And then it was interesting, one of our first conversations with, we're really fortunate to have some venture backing from Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is Bill Gates-backed $2 billion venture fund. And the thesis that guides Breakthrough Energy Ventures investments is they want to invest in companies that have the potential to reduce a gigaton or more of carbon from the atmosphere every year. And so that's where they start, which of course is a very different place for many venture capital companies. And so it was really interesting in some of these kind of like early days questions of them. Are they going to be investors? Are they going to be, once they were going to be investors and they were in, they were like, if you guys can do this in the crowded category that is dairy, imagine what you can do outside of this and anywhere else. And so in some ways they were like, yeah, let's see what consumer demand looks like in this really crowded and competitive category. And it's been really interesting. Like we don't have a ton, we're still very much like in the mode of like gathering consumer insights, but we do have good feedback from folks that say things like, folks who buy our milk who say things like, oh, I would have bought like a plant-based, something, but now I'll buy this. Or I would have, typically bought skim, but you only have 2% or whole. I guess I'll buy that. So those are the kinds of like behavior changes that folks are making, and some of the feedback that we're getting that we're thinking, okay, this is positive and this is encouraging.
Is all your milk certified organic?
Not all of it. We have some food. We have a very busy organic presence in retail, and we do have a subset of food service that is conventional. So if you go to, there's some like pretty awesome restaurants while you're in Portland, we'll recommend, who also have Neutral.
Okay.
And that's conventional milk, yeah.
And I did also want to ask, you talked a little bit about, and you can say, no, we can't talk about it, but you're in dairy, and you talked about your meat product that's coming up. What other places can Neutral
we're still
have an
figuring
impact.
it out.
Yeah.
No, and it's not even being cagey. I mean, we'll always play in staples. We've got some great opportunity with dairy, great opportunity with meat, but we've got a lot of room to grow in those categories, right? So we've already gone from 2 to 5 SKUs in dairy. But yeah, I think that there's still like a very active exploration of like, what else could we be? Where else should we be? Mm-hmm. Who are the right partners for us to work with in manufacturing those products? So that's very much like, yeah, we're working through it.
As you go.
Yeah.
Well, and our name's getting out there. I mean, I've seen Neutral, we've won many awards, Inc. magazine and things like that. And so as our name gets out there, people will come to us, and you never know what opportunities will present itself. So I think that being a startup, we can be lighter on our feet a little bit and do a lot of dreaming still. And so, but the dairy definitely is the staple, and it's what drives me. I love working with cattle. And so, and with dairy farmers. Dairy farmers are the best. They're the best. Every friend I have, I think, is a dairy farmer. So, I mean.
Well, if a farmer is interested in talking with you about a project, how do they? What is the next step then?
Okay, they can email me at jake@eatneutral.com. That's a good way to get a hold of me, and I can respond back and have a call back or have a conversation over email.
And that's only in like if there's project in certain parts of the country that you would be able to help out with, right?
Right. We work within our supply shed.
Sure. Yep.
And so
Yep.
it would need to be projects that within dairy or dairy feed that would be within the farms where we source milk from.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of work in the Pacific Northwest. We do some work in Mid-Atlantic and Wisconsin. Those are like great places where we're targeting projects. And in addition, we're really excited about a new partnership we have with another startup called Farm Raise. So Farm Raise started some really smart gals who came out of the Stanford MBA program who, they themselves come from, farming families, and said, why is it so hard for us to track down conservation funding to make the improvements that we want to? So we can all relate to I called NRCS, I left a message, then they got back to me, they told me to call my soil monitor of a conservation district, but their priorities weren't aligned with what I wanted to do. So they were trying to basically simplify that complexity. They have a 15-minute application process that you can fill out on their website. I did it for my family's place. It's remarkably easy. And then you can get they have kind of a freemium model. You can not pay and get a readout of here's all the conservation services that apply. You can get some additional kind of premium services and potential access to other funding by a very affordable membership. So we at Neutral are the first private money that is also made available through the Farm Raise platform. So in addition to what NRCS funds or what local soil and water conservation districts might fund, you can also find access to Neutral capital there. And so I think it's about a 10 to 15 minute survey you can work through and get to, hey, are you a farmer in an area that we want to support projects, and are you interested in the type of improvement that aligns with the projects that we're seeking to fund, and hopefully pretty quickly get to at least a conversation with Jake.
I'm sorry about that, everybody.
And that's farmraise.com?
You got it.
Okay,
Yeah.
Perfect.
Well, this was a really interesting and a kind of a different conversation that we've had on the podcast before. So I want to thank Jake for mentioning that we should definitely have you on. And I just want to thank you both for taking the time to sit down. I thoroughly enjoyed this.
I did too. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much.
Thank you.